Could you kind of describe what your paper is about and like what is a monopsony? What is monopsony power? Why is this research important? That kind of thing.
For sure. So I think in a previous episode, we talked about minimum wages, and I chatted a bit about monopsony power then. Essentially, monopsony power, in its simplest explanation, is it's having some purchasing power. So if a company is able to sort of set the prices that it pays for things in some way, then it has some power, and we call that monopsony power. In particular, when we talk about monopsony power, but not always, we're often thinking about labor markets. So if people are buying labor, it's the wage. Do they get to have some influence on the wage, or do they just have to take the wage that's offered? When I was a kid in Canada in the 90s, Walmart ended up buying a bunch of these stores. They were just Canadian department stores and moved in. And I remember a lot of people getting upset about this, including my parents. I didn't really understand at the time because I was like, oh, Walmart, I don't really know what that is, but like they have lower prices, I've heard. Like, why are people so up in arms about that? And it kind of stuck with me. As I started my PhD, wow, a while ago, I kind of had in mind that I wanted to really explore this. Like, what is the impact of Walmart on communities where it enters?
And one of the things I think your paper demonstrates is how these supermarkets lead to labor concentration. Could you explain what the concern with this is? Is this kind of what allows them to
Mm.
keep wages stagnant, or what are the effects that we see from that?
Right. So one of the ways, and economists disagree on how great a way of kind of measuring market power this is, especially monopsony power. But one of the ways that we kind of try to get at is to see how concentrated employment is within an industry, and especially within an employer. If one employer really has control of a lot of the jobs, then they kind of really get more opportunity in a lot of ways to say, like, hey, this is sort of what we're putting on offer now, and you got to take it. If you believe that's how wage negotiations work, other people might say, well, the employees know that that employer needs people, so they have some bargaining power. So it's not necessarily clear, but if you see that Walmart comes in and becomes a much bigger share, or the retail sector where they operate becomes a much bigger share of local employment, then that means at least two things. One, that Walmart is concentrating more of the employment that exists within its own sector and probably within its own walls. But also, you're talking about the retail sector in particular being more important locally. And retail traditionally, and still, very widespread today, does not pay particularly high wages, doesn't offer good benefits. It is really not a great set of opportunities overall for the vast majority of people in that sector. And if you're making a local economy more dependent on this not ideal sector, you're kind of effectively weakening the impact that the more high-paying jobs and just the stronger economic industries may actually have locally. So it's not a great situation. It's kind of suggesting, hmm, there might be something to look at here. It doesn't say that there is a negative effect, but it is suggestive.
And I am curious because that's something I saw in your paper was that Walmart's self-imposed minimum wage was lower than other like Amazon, Costco. What is it? Is it just this labor concentration, or are there other factors that go into allowing them to get away with paying
Mm.
lower wages than might otherwise prevail?
Yeah, well, I mean, and that's really the question, or one of the big questions that I'm trying to answer. Like, why are we seeing this for Walmart in particular, and would we expect to see it elsewhere? Why is Costco paying these higher wages when they probably could get away with paying lower wages? And there are lots of possible answers. One is that, hey, there's a lot less turnover when you have higher wages. People are less inclined to go find a different job, and workers who have been tenured for a while tend to be higher productivity, so you don't have to pay to replace them, and they provide more to your business. That might seem like a positive. It may also be that Walmart just says, look, the value of the people that we hire is lower than the value of the people that Costco hires, and so we're just paying them the wage that they could get anywhere. Now, if that was the case, then you would actually not expect to see really any impact of Walmart on these places. And in fact, you would still expect to see wages for retail workers shoot up when Walmart comes in, because a Walmart supercenter hires a lot of people. It's like 350 people per store. But not only did we not see any sustained increase in wages for retail workers as a result of Walmart coming in, we saw sharp declines in employment and wages outside of the retail sector. And I think that is kind of really suggestive of some broader monopsony power that I actually argue is related to its suppliers as well.
I am curious, having looked into this and done the work on it, what came to my mind that people, the first response people might have is like a trade-off of sorts, right? Because as we spoke to at the beginning, when people talk about Walmart, they talk about lower prices. You said like when you were a kid, you're like, oh, this seems like a great thing. Do the negative effects outweigh like the benefits, like the lower costs, or is this like an equal trade-off?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question, right? Because ultimately, what matters is, are you better off or worse off as a result of this locally? What other papers found, and it sort of differs by paper, but the papers that looked at prices found that effectively Walmart brings lower prices of, up to 20% lower on groceries. And they did some back of the envelope calculations and they said what this means is that if everybody in a place where Walmart opens, if every single person shopped at Walmart for their groceries, then they would save on average just over 3% of the value of their income per year. So, that's 3% effectively like, GDP in a way you could think of it, really not, but like, family GDP, but for everybody, that's quite a bit. If we saw something that suggested that Walmart actually decreased local earnings overall even more than that, that would mean that even if everybody shopped at Walmart for its groceries, then we would have a more negative impact. And in fact, we know that, of course, most people do not shop at Walmart for all or probably even most of their groceries. So it's probably a much smaller overall impact. But what I found was that, in fact, the negative impact on total earnings in a county earned by everybody declined by more than the amount that prices would have effectively compensated people for if everybody in that county shopped at Walmart. And because of that, we can say that while this is an empirical question, yes, Walmart ended up hurting these places more than it helped them. And in addition, we also result, or the ultimate consequence was federal spending on things like the earned income tax credit and Medicaid ended up going up quite a lot. So, in addition to these negative local impacts, there were also larger fiscal impacts that everyone else was responsible for as well.
Do you think that this is an outcome just of like scale, corporatization, or do you think this is more of like deliberate strategy from Walmart? Like, is it specific to Walmart as a retailer, or could this like be extrapolated to all corporations that scale to that level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Walmart definitely has an intentional strategy of keeping wages low. That said, I don't think that these effects are the result of an intentional strategy by Walmart. I don't think Walmart is looking to impoverish places where it opens. I think it prefers to have places that have more money to spend at Walmart. Um, it'll take what it gets, and it gets quite a lot. It does pretty well with this. Um, but there are ways that we could effectively undermine Walmart's ability to do this, and other firms that might have this sort of monopsony power, in ways that benefit workers and, for all we know, would not be to the detriment of the firms, despite it costing them more. For example, minimum wages can actually be a very good way of addressing monopsony power. This is something we talked about in the past, one of my other papers. It's something that I show here too. It's sort of a follow-on analysis to really demonstrate there's monopsony power here. I look at the impact of the mid 90s federal minimum wage increases, and I look at places that already had a supercenter, and I just compare to all those donor pool counties that did not have a supercenter. What was the impact of the federal minimum wage increase? Places that had a supercenter saw a sharp increase in retail employment and in earnings. Now, this is exactly what we would expect if we had any sort of employer paying a premium or a negative premium to workers relative to what would exist in the labor market in the absence of any of this sort of market power, this monopsony power. So when we increase the minimum wage, what we're saying is Walmart, you don't get to actually pay that lower wage that you can, and maybe even you think is ideal for you. You have to pay this minimum wage that is now higher, just like everybody else. There's some good evidence that certain firms collude with each other. For example, having non-compete clauses or no poaching clauses in particular. Like fast food places often make agreements or have made agreements in the past saying, I won't hire your workers away and you don't hire my workers away. And what that means is that these workers just have fewer outside options, so they don't get to negotiate higher wages. Now, that is very intentional collusion. That's something that we can directly address, not with something like a minimum wage per se, although that would help, but with prosecuting these sorts of firms that are intentionally trying to reduce competition for the workforce that they want to employ.